Picture this. You are a 13-year-old boy named Marcus, standing in the marble atrium of a Roman villa in the year 96 AD. The morning sun streams through the open roof, casting geometric patterns across the polished floor. You wear a simple white tunic, and your dark hair has been carefully oiled by the household slaves. Today feels different, though you cannot understand why. The other servants move with unusual haste, their eyes avoiding yours as they prepare for visitors. From the kitchen comes the rich aroma of roasted meat and honeyed wine, preparations for a feast that seems far too elaborate for an ordinary day. What you do not know is that 3 days ago, your name was written on papyrus and placed in a silver bowl. What you do not know is that the visitors are not here for business. They are here to inspect their purchase. You touch the small wooden horse in your belt, carved by your father before you were sold to pay his debts. You have kept it hidden for 2 years, a secret connection to the life you once knew. Tonight, they will find it and burn it before your eyes, the first step in erasing every trace of who you used to be. By dawn, you will understand what the older slaves meant when they whispered that some fates are worse than death. This was the reality for thousands of young men across the Roman Empire, boys fed into a machine of exploitation that operated for centuries behind marble columns and silk curtains. The system that destroyed Marcus was not individual cruelty, but institutional design, a network of abuse that turned children into objects for Rome's elite pleasure. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Roman Empire controlled over 5 million square kilometers and 60 million people, but behind its architectural wonders lay a darker foundation built on human suffering. Conservative estimates suggest that over 800,000 young men served as male concubines throughout the empire's history, their lives consumed by a system that treated human beings as renewable resources for elite entertainment. The practice was not hidden by Roman standards. Wealthy citizens openly competed to acquire the most beautiful young men, displaying them at dinner parties like living artwork. The finest specimens commanded prices equivalent to an entire year's wages for a skilled craftsman. A particularly prized boy from Greece or Egypt might cost more than a small villa, his value determined by factors that reduced human worth to a catalog of physical attributes. The true horror lay in the systematic nature of the trade. Across the empire, specialized markets operated with commercial efficiency. In Rome's slave market near the Forum, young men were displayed on raised platforms while buyers examined their teeth, tested their reflexes, and evaluated their potential for various forms of service. Sellers maintained detailed records of each boy's origin, age, and previous training, treating human inventory with the same attention given to livestock. The economic incentives reached into every corner of Roman society. Poor families facing starvation could sell their sons for immediate payment, often justifying the transaction as giving their children opportunities for advancement. Raiders and pirates knew that young male captives commanded premium prices, making them priority targets during military campaigns. Even legitimate merchants supplemented their income by identifying promising boys in distant provinces and arranging their transport to urban markets. What made the Roman system particularly devastating was its integration with the empire's legal structures. Unlike common slaves who retained some basic protections under law, male concubines occupied a gray area where their master's desires took precedence over any consideration of their welfare. They could not seek help from authorities, could not form relationships with others, and could not even own property. Their existence was defined entirely by their utility to their owners. The training process that transformed free boys into compliant concubines was as systematic as any military operation. Specialized schools operated throughout the empire, each developing techniques for breaking down resistance and creating perfect obedience. These institutions studied human psychology with scientific precision, identifying the most effective methods for destroying individual will while maintaining physical attractiveness. The geographic scope reveals the truly industrial scale. Boys were collected from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, with different regions prized for different qualities. Celtic boys were valued for their fair complexions and fierce spirits that made their eventual submission more satisfying. Greek youths commanded high prices for their supposed intellectual refinement. Germanic captives were sought for their physical strength and exotic appearance. The transportation networks that moved these human commodities across the empire rivaled those used for grain and luxury goods. Specialized ships carried cargo holds full of chained boys across the Mediterranean, while overland routes moved smaller groups through mountain passes. The mortality rate during transport was considered acceptable overhead, factored into pricing like any other business expense. Roman literature provides disturbing glimpses into how completely this system was accepted by elite society. Poets wrote admiringly of particularly beautiful concubines. Philosophers debated proper training methods for young servants, and historians recorded the sexual preferences of emperors and generals as routine biographical details. The suffering of the boys themselves was simply invisible to a culture that viewed them as objects rather than people. The most chilling aspect was how the system created its own perpetrators. Many overseers and trainers who broke new arrivals were themselves former concubines, who had survived long enough to earn positions of limited authority. Having learned that compliance offered the only path to survival, they became enthusiastic enforcers of the very system that had destroyed their own childhoods. Archaeological evidence from across the empire confirms this scale. Excavations of wealthy Roman villas regularly uncover quarters designed specifically for housing multiple young male servants, complete with chains, locks, and punishment devices. Medical instruments found at these sites suggest that surgical procedures were performed to modify the bodies of concubines according to their master's preferences. Operations conducted without modern medical knowledge or pain management. The first sign that something terrible was approaching came when Gaius Aurelius himself entered the atrium, something that had never happened during Marcus's 2 years in the household. The master typically communicated through his steward, maintaining proper distance between owner and property. But today he walked directly to Marcus, circling him slowly like a merchant examining a horse for purchase. Marcus had learned to stand perfectly still during inspections, keeping his eyes downcast and his breathing shallow. Movement could be interpreted as defiance, and defiance meant punishment that left marks for weeks. But this inspection felt different, more thorough and calculating than usual checks for cleanliness or grooming. Gaius lifted Marcus's chin, examining his teeth, checking his eyes for disease, running hands through the oiled hair. When he pulled back the boy's tunic to inspect his chest and shoulders, Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with morning air. The buyers arrived just after midday, their litters announcing wealth through gold fittings and silk curtains. Marcus watched from the kitchen doorway as they were welcomed into the villa's most luxurious reception room, reserved for only the most important visitors. Through the partly open door, he caught glimpses of men in expensive togas, their conversation punctuated by laughter that made his stomach clench with unnamed dread. Marcus had been sold before when his father's farm failed and creditors demanded payment. But that transaction had been desperate necessity, parents choosing a son's slavery over family starvation. This felt different, calculated, and commercial in a way that suggested he was not being transferred to another household, but entering something far worse. The summons came as afternoon shadows grew long. Marcus was ordered to bathe, oil his skin until it gleamed, and dress in his finest tunic, the one reserved for festivals. His hair, was arranged in the Greek style that Gaius preferred, with careful curls framing his face. When he looked at his reflection in the polished bronze mirror, he saw a stranger, someone prepared for display rather than service. When Marcus entered the reception room, the conversation stopped abruptly. The buyers, 3 middle-aged men in senatorial stripes, examined him with focused attention they might give to particularly fine sculpture. One gestured for him to turn slowly, allowing evaluation from every angle. Another asked him to speak, testing the quality of his voice and purity of his Latin pronunciation. The negotiation that followed treated Marcus as if he were invisible, the men discussing his qualities and potential uses while he stood motionless in the center of the room. They debated his likely endurance, speculated about his previous training, and calculated how long he might remain useful before requiring replacement. The price they settled on was higher than Marcus had ever heard for a human being, a sum that represented his complete transformation from person to luxury commodity. What Marcus did not understand was that he was being purchased not by one man, but by a consortium, 3 wealthy Romans who shared ownership of particularly expensive acquisitions. They maintained a private facility outside the city where they kept their collection of young men, a place designed specifically for systematic exploitation. His individual worth had been calculated based on his potential to provide entertainment not just for one household, but for multiple masters and their guests. The contract signing was a formal affair, with witnesses and official seals treating the transfer of a human life as routine business. Marcus watched his ownership change hands with the same legal precision used for property or livestock. In Roman law's eyes, he had just become a thing rather than a person, his entire existence reduced to terms written on papyrus scrolls. Transport happened immediately, before he could process what was occurring. Chained to prevent escape, Marcus was loaded into a covered wagon alongside 3 other boys purchased from different sources. Their ages ranged from perhaps 11 to 15, and their expressions carried the same mixture of confusion and terror-building in his own chest. During the journey, Marcus tried to speak with the other boys, hoping to understand where they were being taken. But the oldest boy, who had clearly been in the system longer, warned him that conversation was forbidden and would result in severe punishment for all of them. They traveled in silence, each alone with his fears as the wagon carried them toward their shared fate. The facility they reached as darkness fell was unlike anything Marcus had seen before. Built like a fortress, but decorated like a palace, it combined maximum security with luxurious appointments designed to impress visitors. High walls topped with iron spikes surrounded gardens and buildings that spoke of enormous wealth, invested in a very specific purpose. This was not a simple household, but an institution, a place where systematic exploitation had been refined into an art form. The quarters where Marcus was housed bore no resemblance to normal slave accommodations. The room was luxuriously appointed with silk hangings, comfortable furniture, and even books and musical instruments. But the windows were barred, the door locked from outside, and every surface designed to prevent escape or self-harm. This was a gilded cage, beautiful enough to confuse a young mind about the nature of captivity while ensuring absolute control. Marcus soon learned that luxury was part of the conditioning process. Boys who were treated well became psychologically dependent on their captors, grateful for comfort, even as they were systematically broken down. Gifts of fine clothing, good food, and small privileges created emotional bonds that made resistance difficult and compliance more likely. Training began with seemingly innocent instruction in music, poetry, and conversation. Marcus was assigned tutors who taught him to play the lyre, recite classical verses, and engage in witty dialogue